January 1966. Cu Chi District, South Vietnam. American soldiers at Cu Chi Base Camp were dying in ways that made no sense. Helicopter motors were damaged without anyone approaching them. Food disappeared from locked storage areas. Men were killed in their cots while sleeping, stabbed or shot by attackers who seemed to materialize from nowhere and vanish just as impossibly. Security patrols found no breach in the perimeter. Guard towers reported no movement. Motion sensors detected nothing. Yet every few nights, another soldier died, another aircraft was sabotaged, another supply cache was raided. The Americans had built one of their largest bases in South Vietnam directly on top of the most extensive enemy tunnel network in military history. Beneath their feet, as many as 16,000 Viet Cong soldiers lived, worked, and waged war from an underground city that stretched over 250 kilometers. The Americans had no idea. Cu Chi District sits approximately 40 kilometers northwest of Saigon, in an area known as the Iron Triangle. The region formed a strategic corridor between Cambodia and the South Vietnamese capital. Control of Cu Chi meant control of supply routes, staging areas, and access to Saigon itself. In 1965, American military planners identified Cu Chi as the perfect location for a major base. The terrain seemed suitable. The location provided strategic positioning. Construction began on what would become one of the largest American installations in South Vietnam. Engineers cleared jungle. Construction crews poured concrete. Within months, Cu Chi Base Camp housed thousands of American soldiers, primarily from the 25th Infantry Division. The base included helicopter pads, vehicle maintenance facilities, ammunition storage, living quarters, command centers, and all the infrastructure required for major military operations. The base was state-of-the-art by 1960s standards. Motion sensors ringed the perimeter. Guard towers provided overlapping fields of fire. Razor wire and defensive positions created multiple security layers. The Americans believed they had built an impregnable fortress. They had actually built their headquarters directly on top of the enemy's underground command center. The incidents began almost immediately after the base became operational. At first, they seemed like isolated security breaches. A guard found dead at his post. A supply tent ransacked, equipment damaged. But the pattern made no sense. Guards at adjacent towers saw nothing. Perimeter patrols found no footprints, no disturbance in the defensive wire, no evidence anyone had entered or exited the base. The attacks happened in the most secure areas deep inside the compound where unauthorized personnel simply couldn't reach. Then the helicopter sabotage escalated. Chinook helicopters, massive transport aircraft worth millions of dollars, were found with critical components damaged or removed. The sabotage was sophisticated, targeting specific systems that would cause catastrophic failure during flight. Mechanics discovered cut hydraulic lines, removed bolts, and damaged rotor assemblies. The helicopters were parked in secured areas under guard, yet somehow saboteurs were reaching them undetected, performing complex mechanical sabotage and disappearing without trace. Food theft became systematic. Locked storage areas were emptied overnight. The missing supplies weren't random pilferage. Entire pallets of rations disappeared. Cases of food vanished from warehouses that remained locked and showed no signs of forced entry. Security increased dramatically. More guards, more patrols, more sensors, guard dogs, nothing worked. The incidents continued. Soldiers began reporting strange sounds at night. Voices seeming to come from underground, movement beneath barracks floors, the scraping of metal on metal from below ground level. Most officers dismissed these reports as nerves, as soldiers spooked by the mysterious attacks creating phantom threats. But a few began to suspect the impossible. The enemy wasn't breaching the perimeter from outside. They were already inside, beneath the base, moving through spaces the Americans didn't know existed. January 8, 1966. Operation Crimp, American military intelligence had identified the Cu Chi area as containing a major Viet Cong headquarters. They planned a massive operation involving over 8,000 troops from the 1st Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. It was the largest American military operation in South Vietnam to that date. The operation began with massive aerial bombardment. B-52 bombers dropped 30-ton loads of high explosives onto the Cu Chi region. The jungle, once lush and green, transformed into a cratered moonscape. Trees were obliterated. The earth itself seemed to heave and shift from the explosive force. Then the ground troops moved in. 8,000 soldiers swept through the devastated area, searching methodically for enemy forces, weapons caches, and the suspected headquarters location. They found almost nothing. No enemy soldiers, no bodies from the bombing, no abandoned positions. The Viet Cong had simply disappeared. Frustrated troops searched buildings, investigated suspicious areas, and tried to understand where thousands of enemy fighters had gone. The bombing should have destroyed everything. The ground assault should have caught anyone who survived. Instead, they faced an empty battlefield. Then an Australian engineer moving through a bombed-out area noticed something odd. The ground beneath his feet sounded hollow. He scraped away leaves and dirt, revealing a small wooden trapdoor perfectly camouflaged with natural materials. The door was maybe 18 inches square, barely large enough for a person to fit through. He lifted the trapdoor. Below was darkness and a narrow shaft descending straight down into the earth. He had found the entrance to the Cu Chi tunnel system. What the Australians discovered over the following 4 days fundamentally changed American understanding of the enemy they faced. This wasn't a simple tunnel or even a network of connected passages. It was an entire underground civilization. The tunnels existed on 3 distinct levels. The first level, approximately 3 to 4 meters underground, contained the primary living and working spaces. The second level, at 6 to 8 meters depth, provided additional protection and housed critical facilities. The third and deepest level, reaching 10 to 12 meters underground, served as final refuge during heavy bombing and contained the most sensitive command facilities. The engineering was sophisticated beyond anything the Americans expected from an enemy they considered technologically inferior. Tunnels weren't straight passages but zigzagged at angles between 60 and 120 degrees. This design prevented line-of-sight shooting if attackers entered the system. It also helped deflect explosive blasts, channeling force around corners rather than through long, straight sections. The soil at Cu Chi was perfect for tunnel construction. The laterite clay, rich in iron and other minerals, could be easily dug by hand when moist, but when exposed to air, it hardened to near-concrete strength. The Viet Cong had identified and exploited a geological accident that made their impossible project possible. Ventilation systems were ingeniously concealed. Air shafts extended to the surface but were disguised as termite mounds or natural features. Some pointed east to catch morning light. Others angled into prevailing winds to improve air circulation. The ventilation was sufficient to support thousands of people living underground for extended periods. Water sources were carefully managed. Wells dug into underground aquifers provided drinking water. Drainage systems channeled away excess moisture. The tunnels remained remarkably dry despite being underground in a tropical climate with heavy seasonal rains. But the true shock came when Australian engineers began mapping what they found. Living quarters with bamboo bed frames. Kitchens with ventilated cooking areas where smoke was channeled through complex systems to emerge far from the actual fire, preventing detection. Medical facilities with surgical equipment and hospital beds. Ammunition factories where unexploded American bombs were disassembled and converted into mines and grenades. Storage rooms packed with weapons, food, and supplies. Command centers with maps, communications equipment, and planning facilities. There were even entertainment areas. Small theaters where performers brought from Saigon entertained exhausted fighters. Classrooms where political education continued even during intense bombing. The tunnels weren't just military infrastructure, they were a functioning underground society. The scale was staggering. Initial estimates suggested 17 kilometers of tunnels in the immediate area. As exploration continued, that estimate grew. 20 kilometers. 50 kilometers. The actual extent was far larger. The complete Cu Chi tunnel system eventually measured over 250 kilometers of interconnected passages, chambers, and facilities. And the Americans had built their base directly on top of it. Every helicopter pad, every ammunition dump, every command center sat above an enemy population that could emerge from hidden trapdoors, attack, and disappear back underground before response forces could react. Understanding the tunnels existed was one thing. Clearing them was entirely different. The Americans needed soldiers willing to crawl into narrow, pitch-black passages rigged with booby traps, possibly occupied by armed enemy fighters and infested with deadly creatures. They called for volunteers. The requirements were specific. Small stature to fit through passages sometimes only 80 centimeters high and 60 centimeters wide. Volunteers only because the psychological demands were extreme. No claustrophobia, steady nerves, willingness to face certain death in conditions that defied rational courage. The tunnel rats, as they became known, carried minimal equipment. A flashlight, a pistol, usually a .45 caliber because the concussive blast in enclosed spaces was devastating. A knife, sometimes a length of communications wire to maintain contact with the surface. That was all. They used the term black echo to describe what they experienced in the tunnels. Total darkness beyond the flashlight beam. Sounds distorted by enclosed spaces and earthen walls. The smell of decay, human waste, cordite, and fear. Air that was barely breathable, heat that was suffocating, and the knowledge that death could come from any direction at any moment. The Viet Cong had prepared extensive booby traps throughout the tunnel system. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo spears coated with human waste to cause infection, concealed in false floors or walls. Tripwires connected to grenades positioned to spray shrapnel through confined spaces. Pits covered with thin material that collapsed when weight was applied, dropping tunnel rats onto stakes below. Some traps were psychological. Boxes of scorpions positioned above tunnel entrances rigged to overturn onto anyone entering. Cages of venomous snakes placed where intruders would encounter them in darkness. The Viet Cong knew that fear was as effective as actual harm in the claustrophobic tunnels. Tunnels themselves contained defensive features. Trap doors that could be sealed to isolate sections. Water traps where chambers could be rapidly flooded, drowning anyone inside. False passages that dead-ended, trapping pursuers. Fighting positions where defenders with perfect knowledge of the tunnel layout could ambush attackers forced to move slowly through unknown territory. Tunnel rats faced another enemy beyond human defenders and booby traps. The tunnels were infested with genuinely deadly creatures. Venomous centipedes grew to lengths of 12 to 15 centimeters, their bites causing agonizing pain and potentially fatal reactions. Scorpions abounded in the darkness. Various snake species, including cobras and kraits, sheltered in the tunnels. Rats, the actual rodents from which the soldiers took their nickname, swarmed through passages. Disease-carrying mosquitoes bred in standing water. Spiders of various species, some harmless, others dangerous, occupied every corner. One tunnel rat later described the experience. You're crawling through absolute darkness except for your light. You can hear breathing, real quiet. You know someone's in there with you. You don't know if it's 5 feet ahead or 50 feet. You don't know if they're armed. You don't know if the next thing you touch is a person, a tripwire, or a scorpion. Every movement could kill you. And you're thinking about the tons of earth above your head, knowing that if the tunnel collapses, nobody's digging you out. You're just gone. Despite the extreme danger, Tunnel rats earned respect from their Viet Cong enemies. Captured tunnel rats reportedly received better treatment than regular American prisoners. The Vietnamese understood the extraordinary courage required to enter the tunnels voluntarily, and they honored that bravery even in enemies. One Australian engineer, Corporal Robert Bowtell, died during Operation Crimp when he became trapped in a tunnel that proved to be a dead end. He was the first of many tunnel rats who would die in the underground war. His death illustrated the fundamental problem. The Viet Cong knew every centimeter of their tunnels. The tunnel rats were blind men fighting in a darkness they couldn't fathom. For the Viet Cong living in the tunnels, existence was harsh beyond description. Yet thousands endured it for months or years at a time, choosing underground suffering over surface exposure. Daily life followed rigid patterns necessary for survival in the confined spaces. During daylight hours, most fighters remained underground, working, resting, or preparing for night operations. Only at night would they emerge to tend crops, gather supplies, or conduct attacks. The tunnels were hot. Body heat from hundreds or thousands of people in confined spaces raised temperatures significantly. Combined with tropical heat conducting through the earth and minimal ventilation, conditions became nearly unbearable. Fighters worked and slept in temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius with humidity approaching 100%. Air quality was marginal. Carbon dioxide built up despite ventilation systems. Cooking fires, even with careful smoke management, fouled the air. The breath of thousands of people in enclosed spaces created an atmosphere that was barely adequate for sustaining life. Newcomers to the tunnels often experienced severe headaches, dizziness, and nausea until they acclimatized. Food was scarce. Supplies brought into the tunnels consisted mainly of rice with occasional vegetables or meat. Water was rationed carefully. Cooking required special techniques to minimize smoke and conserve fuel. Meals were minimal, providing just enough nutrition to sustain combat effectiveness. Sanitation was a constant challenge. Waste disposal systems existed but were primitive. Disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces. Malaria was endemic. Intestinal parasites infected nearly everyone. Skin diseases flourished in the heat and humidity. Medical care was limited to what could be provided in underground facilities with minimal supplies. The darkness was absolute in sections without lighting. Fighters learned to navigate by touch and memory. They developed acute hearing, learning to identify sounds and movements in total darkness. Some spent weeks or months without seeing daylight, existing in permanent night. Psychological pressure was immense. The weight of Earth overhead created constant low-level fear of collapse. The knowledge that American bombs could bury everyone alive haunted every moment. The sounds of bombardment overhead, the concussive shock waves traveling through the earth, the terror of wondering if the next explosion would cave in the tunnels created stress that never fully abated. Yet they endured. Thousands of men, women, and even children lived in the tunnels for the duration of the war. They worked in underground factories manufacturing weapons. They trained in underground schools. They planned operations in underground command centers. They received medical treatment in underground hospitals. They entertained themselves in underground theaters. They built an entire society beneath the earth. The Viet Cong who defended the tunnels during Operation Crimp paid a terrible price. Of approximately 300 defenders when the operation began, only 4 survived the war. The attrition rate among tunnel defenders was catastrophic. Yet replacements kept coming, willing to take their place in the underground war. By Vietnamese estimates, approximately 12,000 Viet Cong and civilians died in the Cu Chi tunnels over the course of the war. Some died in combat. Many more died from disease, malnutrition, tunnel collapses, and the cumulative effects of years spent underground in barely survivable conditions. The discovery of the tunnel system's true scale forced the Americans to develop new tactics and technologies. Traditional military solutions proved inadequate against an enemy who could literally disappear into the ground. Initial responses were crude: pump water into tunnel entrances to flood the system, pour hot tar into openings, pump tear gas or other chemical agents into passages, toss grenades down discovered shafts and seal them with explosives. These methods proved largely ineffective. The tunnel design with its multiple levels, sealed sections, and water traps defeated flooding attempts. The Viet Cong would simply seal off flooded sections and continue operating from other areas. Gas dispersed through the ventilation systems or was blocked by sealed doors. Grenades and explosives destroyed local sections but barely impacted the overall system. The Americans brought in specialized equipment: bulldozers to excavate tunnels from above, armored vehicles called tunnel destroyers equipped with massive plows to rip up the earth, chemical defoliants to remove vegetation that concealed tunnel entrances. Even a special fast-growing grass with sharp edges dubbed American grass that killed other vegetation and became razor-sharp when dry, making movement difficult for Viet Cong fighters. None of it worked well enough. The tunnels were too extensive, too well-designed, too deeply embedded in the earth to be destroyed through conventional engineering. The Viet Cong would simply dig new passages around destroyed sections. What took Americans weeks to destroy with heavy equipment could be repaired in days by hand digging. Dogs were trained to detect tunnel entrances by scent. Some were successful, finding hidden trapdoors that human searchers missed. But the Viet Cong adapted, using pepper, garlic, and American soap to mask scents around entrances. They also learned to leave booby traps specifically targeted at dogs, discouraging their use. In 1967, frustrated by continued tunnel resistance, the Americans launched Operation Cedar Falls. This was Operation Crimp on a massive scale, involving 30,000 troops instead of 8,000. The operation uncovered even more tunnels, including a district headquarters containing over 500,000 documents detailing Viet Cong operations, sympathizer networks, and strategic plans. Among the captured documents were detailed maps of American bases, assassination lists, supply route information, and even specific intelligence about American operations. The papers revealed that American bases were thoroughly infiltrated. The Viet Cong knew American plans almost as soon as commanders made them. Despite the intelligence coup, Operation Cedar Falls failed to destroy the tunnel system. Within weeks of American forces withdrawing, the Viet Cong returned to their underground bases, repaired damage, and resumed operations. The tunnels remained a persistent threat throughout the war. January 30th, 1968, the Tet Offensive. The Cu Chi tunnels proved their ultimate strategic value during the massive coordinated attacks on cities across South Vietnam. The tunnels had served as planning centers, staging areas, and supply depots for the offensive. Thousands of fighters moved through the tunnel system, emerging to attack Saigon and other targets before withdrawing back underground. The attacks shocked Americans who believed they were winning the war. The Viet Cong demonstrated they could strike anywhere, anytime, despite years of American operations. The Cu Chi tunnels had enabled this capability. While Americans controlled the surface, the Viet Cong controlled what lay beneath. The Tet Offensive ultimately failed in its military objectives. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic casualties. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks and inflicted enormous losses on the attackers. But the psychological impact was profound. The offensive demonstrated that no amount of American military power could secure South Vietnam as long as the enemy could operate from underground sanctuaries. After Tet, the war shifted. The Viet Cong, having suffered tremendous losses, played a reduced role. North Vietnamese Army regulars carried more of the combat burden. The tunnel's importance diminished as the nature of the war changed. In 1969, American B-52 bombers began concentrated carpet bombing of the Cu Chi area. Unlike previous bombing campaigns that mixed targets, this operation specifically focused on destroying the tunnel system. The bombers dropped thousands of bombs fitted with delayed fuses. These bombs buried themselves deep underground before exploding, creating shock waves that collapsed tunnel sections from within. The sustained bombing campaign, lasting months, finally rendered large portions of the tunnel system uninhabitable. Sections collapsed. Ventilation systems were destroyed. Access became too dangerous even for the Viet Cong. By late 1969, the tunnels had largely been abandoned as military infrastructure. The Americans had finally destroyed what they couldn't defeat. But it had taken 4 years of continuous effort, tens of thousands of bombs, and the commitment of enormous resources. And by then, the war's outcome was already determined in ways that had little to do with tactical victories. The statistics of the Cu Chi tunnels tell a story of impossible engineering and terrible cost. Total tunnel length, over 250 kilometers of interconnected passages. Some estimates range as high as 400 kilometers when including all the smaller connecting tunnels and side passages. Maximum population. Between 5,000 and 16,000 people lived in the tunnels at various times. During heavy bombing or major operations, the number reached the higher end as people sought refuge underground. Depth. 3 levels ranging from 3 meters to 12 meters underground. Some specialized chambers extended even deeper. Construction time. The system was built over approximately 20 years, beginning in the late 1940s during the war against French colonial forces. The system was massively expanded between 1960 and 1965. American casualties from booby traps and mines. Approximately 11% of deaths and 15% of wounds to American soldiers in the Vietnam War came from these types of weapons. Many were in or around the tunnel areas. Viet Cong deaths at Cu Chi, approximately 12,000 over the course of the war. Operation Crimp, 8,000 Allied troops, 14 Americans killed, 8 Australians killed, 102 Americans wounded, 29 Australians wounded. At least 128 Viet Cong killed confirmed, possibly 192 more. Operation Cedar Falls, 30,000 Allied troops, 72 Americans killed, 337 Americans wounded. Estimated 750 Viet Cong killed, 280 captured. Documents captured. Over 500,000 pages of intelligence material during Cedar Falls alone. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels are preserved as a war memorial and tourist attraction. Visitors can crawl through enlarged sections of the original tunnels, though even these expanded passages prove claustrophobic for most Western tourists. The experience gives just a hint of what living and fighting in the actual tunnels must have been like. The tunnels represent one of history's most remarkable engineering achievements accomplished with the most primitive tools. Everything was dug by hand. No machinery, no power tools, just human labor, simple implements, and extraordinary determination over 2 decades. The tunnels also represent a fundamental truth about the Vietnam War. American technological superiority, overwhelming firepower, and massive resources couldn't defeat an enemy willing to live underground for years. The Viet Cong accepted conditions that seemed impossible to endure because the alternative was defeat. For the Americans who fought above and within the Cu Chi tunnels, the experience was profoundly disorienting. They controlled the surface but not what lay beneath. They had superior weapons but fought an enemy they couldn't find. They won tactical victories that meant nothing strategically because the enemy simply withdrew underground and waited. The tunnel rats who ventured into the Black Echo faced an enemy on his own terms in his own environment. The courage required to crawl into darkness knowing death waited around any corner remains one of the war's most remarkable stories of individual bravery. January 1966 to late 1969. Cu Chi District, South Vietnam. The largest American military operation to date found almost nobody because 16,000 people live beneath their feet. Engineers discovered passages containing hospitals, theaters, and entire communities underground. Tunnel rats faced the black echo, crawling through darkness where every breath might be their last. The Cu Chi tunnels changed how America understood the enemy. They weren't technologically inferior farmers fighting with primitive weapons. They were a determined, organized force willing to accept unimaginable hardship to achieve victory. In the end, the tunnels were destroyed by sustained bombing that made them uninhabitable. But by then, they had served their purpose. They had protected the Viet Cong during the years when American military power was at its peak. They had enabled operations including the Tet Offensive. They had demonstrated that determination and ingenuity could counter overwhelming technological superiority. The Americans built their base thinking Cu Chi was secure territory. They were wrong. 16,000 enemies lived beneath them, waiting in the darkness.